The event which brings us together today, albeit in a virtual fashion, focuses on a particular version of the Bible, namely that translated by Gaspar Karoli and subsequently revised by various scholars at the request of Gheorghe Racoții I. Before dealing with the topic which I selected for this colloquium, let me note in passing that it was the same Racoții who was instrumental in sponsoring not only Hungarian printed editions of God's Word, but also the first full edition of the Romanian New Testament published in Alba Iulia in 1648. Although I am only vaguely acquainted with the Karoli Bible, I know enough to be aware that, despite its literary and theological prestige, it was far from perfect. Recently, while doing research on a Romanian collection of sermons translated from Hungarian and published in 1683, I noticed that the Romanian biblical text affixed to the sermon contained interesting renderings which did not correspond either to the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. After exploring the issue in more detail, I realized that the source of the unusual renderings was the Karoli Bible. For instance, in Genesis 37, verse 31, the Romanian text uses a ucide, which corresponds to the Hungarian ölni, to murder, to kill, despite the fact that the Hebrew text uses the verb shahat, to slaughter, which typically has sacrificial or ceremonial overtones. A more interesting example from the same passage is the noun koporsho, which was used by Karoli to translate various biblical terms. For instance, koporsho is employed to render the Hebrew words Sheol, found in Genesis 37, verse 35, and Aron, that is coffin or sarcophagus, used in Genesis 50, verse 2. In the New Testament, koporsho is used to render the Greek mnemeion, that is tomb, see Matthew 27, verse 60. Of course, you all know these aspects much better than I do, so I'll not labor this point. At any rate, it is safe to say that most versions produced in the 17th century, either Hungarian or Romanian, suffer largely from the same type of problems encountered in the Karoli version. I do not know how the revisers have dealt with these issues, but it seems obvious that some changes are required if a classical version is to make sense to contemporary readers. Thus, the topic of revising the Bible brings me to the Romanian version produced by Dumitru Cornilescu, who was born in 1891 and died in 1975. Translated in only 5 years, between 1916 and 1920, and printed in 1921, the new version was in many ways a revolutionary one. It can be classified as domesticating because it made ample use of paraphrase and included many notes with a view to engaging the widest possible public. Cornilescu deliberately used a simple but fluent style because his intended readership consisted mainly of peasants who had only primary education or none at all. Initially, Cornilescu worked independently. His only support came from Princess Raluca Limachi, who provided him with room and board at the estate of her family northeast of Romania in Stâncești, Botoșani. When Robert Kilgore, the literary secretary of the BFBS, the British and Foreign Bible Society, got word of the new version, he made numerous inquiries and requested detailed reports before recommending it to the committee for publication. Due to the fact that other versions were not available in Romania after the First World War, and the Cornilescu version became more and more popular, the editors of BFBS were inclined to adopt it as an official translation, but were cautious because reviewers pointed out the excessive reliance of Cornilescu on the French version produced by the Swiss theologian Louis II. I will illustrate this relationship by selecting only 3 examples. In Genesis 1:21, Cornilescu uses the term pești, that is, fish, whereas the Hebrew has tanenim, that is, sea dragons or sea monsters. This mistranslation is due to the influence exerted by Second, according to whom, I quote, Dieu créa les grands poissons, God created the big fish. Mark 10:34 offers an example in which both Cornilescu and Second run counter to the underlying Greek text. Unexpectedly, the Swiss translator used the expression battre de verge, to beat with rods or canes, for the verb mastigoo, which means to whip or to scourge. The same expression, abate cu nuiele in Romanian, is to be found in Cornilescu. In Galatians 2, verse 2, when Paul describes his meeting with the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, he recalls, I quote, "I went up in response to a revelation. Then I laid before them, though only in a private meeting, Greek Criterion, with the acknowledged leaders, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain." End of quote. The Greek phrase "Criterion" was rendered correctly in French as "en particulier." Due to its ambiguity, the phrase can mean both separately and especially. The translator took it to mean especially and thus rendered it in Romanian as "îndeosebi" in his 1924 edition. It was only in EDCR, published in 2019, that the correct meaning was restored to the text. As I have mentioned already, Cornilescu used copious paraphrases. For instance, he rendered the term dicaiosiune, righteousness, as stare a omului după voia lui Dumnezeu pe care o dă Dumnezeu, that is, in English, the state of a man according to the will of God, which is given by God. This clearly reflected the definition in Joseph Thayer's lexicon used by Cornilescu. According to Thayer, I quote, "Dicaiosiune denotes the state acceptable to God, which becomes a sinner's possession through that faith by which he embraces the grace of God offered him in the expiatory death of Jesus Christ." End of quote. As a prerequisite for publication by BFBS, Cornilescu was asked to revise the text and bring it into line with the rules for the guidance of translators. The translator worked towards this goal, but it soon became obvious that not all rules could be adequately put into practice. Despite its remaining shortcomings, in 1924, Cornilescu's version was published with the imprint of the BFBS and became the main version used by Romanian evangelicals, and in fact by many Orthodox and Catholics. As more feedback came to the Bible House regarding the new version, especially in the first decade since its publication, it became increasingly evident that the text would have to be revised more substantially. At some point, it was suggested that the translator himself should set out to do the job, but Cornilescu fell ill, and this idea was soon abandoned. After the fall of communism in Romania, various Christian organizations made attempts to correct the antiquated spelling of the 1924 edition, but most endeavors can be described, if we can make an allusion to Paul, as being born out of zeal but not according to knowledge. In certain cases, some errors were corrected, but other new ones crept into the text. In most cases, the revisers did not even seek permission from the BFBS and were not interested in creating an interconfessional working committee. A new opportunity for revision emerged in 2014 when I had the privilege of publishing a volume containing letters and papers documenting the history of the Cornilescu version. The 550 letters had lain in the archive of the BFBS for 90 years, and their translation into Romanian with an ample introduction and numerous explanatory notes acquainted the Romanian evangelical readership with the idea that a revision was indeed necessary. As such, in the spring of 2015, the BFBS, in partnership with the Romanian Interconfessional Bible Society, commissioned me to draft the guidelines for the revision project and to assemble an interconfessional panel consisting of 9 scholars coming from various interconfessional backgrounds. The text of the Bible was split into sections which were entrusted to teams made up of 2 revisers. For instance, the New Testament was divided into 2 large sections. One team of biblical scholars was commissioned to revise the Synoptic Gospels and Acts, while the other team was supposed to revise John and the rest of the New Testament. In the following section, I will give a condensed version of the revision process by focusing on the New Testament. The first reviser checked the Cornilescu translation and removed all antiquated words, clarified the syntax, and made the text more concise, seeking to preserve consistency among the synoptics. The second reviser checked the result against the Nestle Aland 28 text and left various comments in paratext, the software we use, if he disagreed with the solutions. The two translators met and the editor-in-chief arbitrated, indicating which solution was preferable. After harmonizing the divergent views of the translators, the editor read the text afresh in order to spot other problems. New meetings were organized to help solve those issues. The next stage involved the literary reviser, who is not familiar with the biblical languages. He read the text and suggested various stylistic improvements, especially where the reviser showed literalistic tendencies. The literary reviser and the editor-in-chief discussed the objections and solved the easy ones. For major changes, the biblical scholars were again consulted for feedback. After a book was green-lighted by the literary reviser and the editor-in-chief, it was sent to the pastoral committee, whose members read it and sent feedback. All the comments were received by the editor-in-chief, who treated them in true biblical fashion, in that many were called, but few were chosen. However, if the pastors were happy with the explanations, we kept the text as such. If they were not happy, we had a meeting, bringing together pastors, the translators, the literary reviser, and decided by consensus what rendering best fit the context. At that stage, a book could almost be considered canonized. Only in exceptional cases could changes be introduced. For instance, to correct a typo or to harmonize a synoptic phrase which had been overlooked by the revisers. The result of this arduous process, which began in June 2015, was published in 2019. Meanwhile, all the Old Testament books have undergone a preliminary revision, but only a third have also been checked by the literary reviser. In the second part of this presentation, I will briefly mention the criteria governing the revision. A full description is given in the introduction to the Revised New Testament of the EDCR. The first criterion is fidelity towards the original texts, as published in the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia and Nestle Aland 28. The second one is continuity with Cornilescu's style and vocabulary wherever possible. The third criterion is renewing the biblical vocabulary, which is dated. The fourth is making a more concise version, because Cornilescu used too much paraphrase. The fifth seeks to introduce more clarity. We want to make sure that the text does not contain ambiguities, except in those places where ambiguities are part of the original. The sixth criterion means keeping a good balance between literalism and functional equivalence. The seventh criterion is readability. The text must be fit for public reading. This does not mean that some parts will not remain difficult. We expect the epistles to make demands on our readers, and this is why we do include explanatory notes. The eighth criterion is consistency. That means that identical passages in the synoptics and similar passages in Paul need to be rendered consistently. The same word should be translated in the same way if the author does not expand its meaning. And the final criterion could be called euphony. If the original text has a certain musicality and rhythm, we aim to keep that in translation, especially in the poetic sections. Because not all criteria can be explained in detail, I will dwell on the theological importance of applying consistency in a micro-context. Terminological consistency is important because it enables the perceptive reader to, so to speak, connect the theological dots. Sometimes by employing a certain term, a biblical author makes a subtle theological point. If that particular term is not rendered adequately, the underlying interpretation may be more difficult to perceive. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul uses the verb katargeo, to do away with or to abolish 4 times. He uses it in verse 8 twice and in verses 10 and 11. Among the things which have a temporary existence are prophecies, knowledge and our partial understanding of God. The fourth occurrence of the verb is used in connection with the childish things which, according to Paul, a man must put away before he becomes an adult. The sequence ekmerus in the pericope 8:12 shows that Paul's flow of thought is tightly woven to the effect that what he says in the first part is mirrored in the second one. Thus, the disappearance of the spiritual gifts is compared to the putting away of childish things. In the words of Richard Hayes, I quote, "Just as the perceptions and communicative strategies of childhood are put aside when one arrives at maturity, so also the Church's present spiritual gifts will be put aside in the eschaton." However, this important connection may not be obvious if the four occurrences of katargeo are rendered inconsistently. In EDCR, we have managed to render the verb katargeo by using a single equivalent, that is asfârși or asfârșicu. In closing, I will also show the importance of preserving as much as possible the intertextual connections between the Old and the New Testament. The first example concerns the presentation of Jesus as the new Moses in the Gospel according to Matthew. In Exodus 4, Moses, who had been living a long time in Midian, is sent back to Egypt to deliver his brothers from bondage. The information in verse 18, "After those many days the king of Egypt had died," is echoed by the sequence when Herod died in Matthew 2, verse 19. Matthew might have used the verb apornesco, to die, in connection with Herod, but he chose to retain the verb teleutao, which in the Septuagint is used in connection with Pharaoh. More intriguing is the fact that the statement in verse 20, "Those who are seeking the child's life are dead," retains the plural, although it might have been more opposite to use the singular, especially since the context indicates clearly that the one person who died was King Herod. The use of the verb pnesco in the plural indicates that Matthew wants to create an intertextual link with the book of Exodus. Further confirmation is the fact that his sentence begins with the verb, creating the same emphasis which is to be found in the Septuagint. The subtle point which Matthew makes is that King Herod was a pharaoh redivivus, and that Jesus is the new Moses who will bring deliverance to his people. This idea is further developed in the Sermon on the Mount, which portrays Jesus as being greater than Moses. The final example illustrating this kind of intertextuality concerns the reception of Genesis 18:14 in Luke 1:37. The story in Genesis 18 involves Sarah, a woman who receives a promise from God but doubts that she can have a baby because she is already very old. In response, God asks her a rhetorical question, "Mea gunatei parato theo rema," which could be rendered, "Nothing is impossible with God, is it?" This text is alluded to by Luke at the beginning of his Gospel, narrating a scene in which another woman doubts a promise involving a child who is part of God's plan. Luke 1:37 is deliberately patterned after the one in Genesis, with two differences. The angel's response is a positive statement, "Uca dunatesei parato theupan rema," not a rhetorical question. A literal rendering would be, "Nothing or no word coming from God is impossible." The second difference is the use of the genitive instead of the dative. While in Genesis the focus is on the fact that nothing is impossible with God, in Luke the main idea is that no word coming from God is devoid of power. It is important to translate the two texts in a manner which makes this link obvious. When Mary is told that she will have a son, but wonders whether this is possible, the angel replies by pointing to the example of Elizabeth, who, despite being sterile, has conceived because nothing is impossible with God, as Sarah's example, described in Genesis 18, demonstrates. Unfortunately, this link is invisible in many translations. See, for instance, the NEB, quote, "Is anything impossible for the Lord?" in Genesis 18, compared to, I quote, "God's promises can never fail" in Luke 1:37. In EDCR, Luke's text in verse 37 is rendered in italics, indicating that this is a quotation from the Old Testament. The reader also finds a brief explanatory note directing him to Genesis 18:14. The application of the criteria surveyed above cannot be made mechanically. For each language, certain adjustments need to be made. However, they serve as basic guidelines, which every committee of translators is bound to discover as its members make their way through the complex collection of text, that is, the Word of God.